So last week I promised you we're going to start a sermon series on death to selfie for Lent, and also on the book of James. But after church last week, I felt more and more led to preach about Ephesians, really to lead us up to James. And I realized that Pastor Jose is going to come next week. So we're going to start that series in a couple of weeks. But today we're going to talk about Ephesians 6, and Marshall Lane is going to read that passage for us this morning. We use the red one here.
Okay, our Bible passage this morning is Ephesians 6, and that in my Bible is found on page 1228. Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 20. And the subtitle, the subheading right here is The Armor of God. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to take your ground. You may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted for the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the saints. Pray also for me, that whenever I open my mouth, words may be given me, so that I will fearlessly make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it fearlessly, as I should. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
As always, if you like to keep your Bibles open to do that. And before I get started, I just want to hand this side. Can you make sure that's a real phone book and pass it around a little bit? So, yeah, make sure it's not like a defective phone book that it's got all the pages, it's not torn out already, or whatever. All right, you can just do that quietly. And we can all ask for it at the end. All right. So we're going to talk about Ephesians 6 as a passage most of you know. Armor of God, great passage. We memorized this, we've looked at this. And if you haven't ever read the Bible before, it's a great passage. It just pops out the page. It's an analogy, right? It's warfare. It's really pops. But I want to start this morning by simply sharing that more on a background about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Of course, gospel is a word that just means good news. But I want to simply share, I love being a representative, a minister, and basically just a Christian who gets to represent the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. There are so many things I love about what I do. One of them is I get to help people in ways that it's wonderful to be used this way. In the last couple of weeks, I was able to bring a piece of like a ham over to somebody who didn't have any food that night, except maybe just some bread products and whatnot. And I knew that, so I brought it over there, and it's like, really? That just showed up at my door? Like, that's a wonderful thing to do. It's able to help someone get a car who hasn't driven in 5-6 years. And again, last month, that was an awesome thing to do. I was spiritually mentoring. I met with somebody yesterday who really didn't have that much experience with the Bible, and so I got to share some really basic but awesome things with this young man about that. It's a real privilege to be able to do that. Also, I think it was just yesterday, maybe the day before, I was able to help Robert McLean move some stuff in the storage unit. to his new apartment down at Ferguson and get to see where that was. And again, it's a real privilege to help just a person who really doesn't have a vehicle or anything to get them moving forward in their life. And it's not only fun in that way, but it's great to be able to interact with church people, to hear your stories, to see the stories of faith, especially the older people who have lived through a lot of difficult circumstances and are now being faithful at times when it's really difficult. Growing old is not for the faint of heart. It's difficult, but the faithfulness continues. And also just seeing each one of you being faithful in really unique contexts is a great privilege, and I get to hear, in some ways, more of those stories, or different stories, or at least in a different way than many of you. I love what I do in terms of helping the church become a place where not just me, but as a church we can become more and more functional and more empowered as a church to represent the gospel to us, our family, and our community. It's just an incredible privilege. But there's also a difficulty to both being a representative of the gospel as a member or just as a Christian, but especially perhaps in thinking about my own experience as a pastor, as a leader of a church, in as much as I am other people are too. There's a real difficulty. And some of that difficulty comes just because there's always more work to do. No matter what you do as a pastor, and sometimes no matter what you do as a Christian, there's always more work to do. You can do 15 things, and there's another 15 things that need to be done. And not only that, but there's the issue of no matter how many good things I'm good at, and I'm good at a fair number of things, there's always things that, I'm not good at. So I'm always bumping up against areas of my ability and areas of my personality where I'm just not gifted at, or I don't have those experiences. And no matter what it is, it becomes an issue, and then I need to figure out how to empower people to fill that, or how to grow and learn into that. And so I'm always running up against my own inadequacies, and I don't think I'm the only one who is running up against my own inadequacies. I think this is a common Christian experience where we can be good at 14 things, but it's the 2 or 3 things that we're not good at that sort of get to us, and we don't know what to do with this. This as Michael Velker shared a few weeks ago, this becomes like the wicked problems in our life, the things that there's no easy answers, and it's difficult. What do you do with that kid at school who's just so irritating all the time to you, or is a bully to you? What do you do with a relationship that you can't figure out? What do you do with a job that you're making money, but it's just really difficult? Or what do you do with sickness when that happens? Or what do you do with the job that you really love but doesn't pay enough money? There's wicked problems, so to speak, all over in our lives. And what do we do when we bump up against inadequacies? So it's difficult. It's difficult to be a faithful representative of the gospel. It's difficult to be a faithful Christian, even though being a Christian is what gives me the greatest joy and the greatest purpose. This morning I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's difficult for another reason too. It's difficult because as people who are following Jesus, we also have a personal, spiritual enemy. And that's what this passage points out. That's what this passage talks about. In the verse right here, it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." That's a bit challenging. Often in the church we think our battle is with that person over there who doesn't agree with us. At work sometimes we think, man, that coworker is just and fill in the blank. Sometimes in our family we think, well, if my wife would just act different, it'd be a lot easier to be a husband, or a father, or a wife, or people would just act hard and think, well, my battle's against them. But the passage here says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The church has had a different response to this over the years, and I think 60 years ago, if you've gone to a Reformed church, or in our past, or over many different types of denominations, this tended to get written off as, well, this is talking about like big time forces, politics, and people who were over us in that way. And we sort of wrote out the spiritual dimension of this. I remember talking to a seminary professor who was a psychologist, and a very good one. And I think because he didn't want people always looking for a demon in somebody's life, he more just wanted them to figure it out and get insight into their problem instead of just trying to pray and have it be gone that way, which doesn't always work so well. he eventually came to the conclusion that demons, well, really that's kind of something to think about a long time ago, and it's best if we don't think about that today. And he really probably didn't believe in them at all. And that's a difficult position to take, because if you believe in the Bible, there's a very huge spiritual dynamic, and Jesus himself is casting out demons, and it's just in the Bible all over the place. But if you haven't experienced this personally, or if you haven't experienced this in your family, well, it's easy to believe that. And I think that's where the church was. We lived and were faithful in many different ways. We didn't experience this on a daily basis. But over the last 10, 15, 50 years perhaps, there's been a couple things happening that have helped us understand that our battle is against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms, at least on some level. I think the first thing that happened, at least in terms of the churches that I was part of, missionaries, we sent missionaries out into the mission field. And they went out into the mission field, and they realized that there's some pretty lively demonic forces that are coming against them, and they had to learn real quick on their feet what to do about them, and they learned to resist the enemy and to pray, and what all was involved in it. They came back with stories, the stories of witch doctors, we called them for a while, and they said, they're powerful, and there's demonic elements, and so-and-so was possessed, and they became a Christian, they got set free. And we sort of, a lot of weird stuff happens on the mission field. Maybe the Bible is true over in whatever country they're in. And then eventually here in America, we started realizing that maybe this is true here too. Partly because not all of us grew up Christian. And when you grow up without spiritual protection, without this sort of natural protection that you get from your parents, you experience some things that aren't exactly sanctified. And so many of you hear a story about when you were young and there was personal spiritual forces of evil that came against you. And then once we started telling these stories, we realized that some of us here in the church are experiencing some things that aren't exactly, non-spiritual, but spiritual and evil. I remember myself, I think I shared this before when I was young, at the foot of my bed, every once in a while there was this, I can't even picture it really well, but there was this real swarthy guy with big curly hair, and he would stand up and go, blah, I don't know what he did, but it terrified me. And I told my parents, no, that's just your imagination, go back to sleep, but it messed with me, it caused me to fear, and it was not very helpful. And eventually it went away because, again, my parents were Christian, they prayed and whatnot. But I realized later, what was that? I think it was a personal spiritual force of evil trying to get a foothold in my life, specifically about fear. Because if you fear, then that's a pathway to a whole lot of stuff. And as I share that story with some people, they're like, yeah, and they have a similar story about evil in their bedroom or something like that. And it's not huge perhaps, but it's enough. It's enough to make you think there's something going on. Remember a story of a friend of mine. This happened a long time ago, maybe in the 70s, probably, or 80s. He said he was in a bad spot, drugs and alcohol and the whole 9 yards, listening to heavy metal, and he got the Black Sabbath tape, those cassette tapes, and he put it in his dash, and as he put that Black Sabbath tape in his dash, and of course that was a satanic band, they started playing a song, like this big black crawly, creepy thing came out of the dash, and was like, rah! So he took that tape out pretty quick, threw it in the back seat, and played it again. And so we have these experiences where you realize that there's probably personal spiritual forces of evil that are out to get us, and we've come to believe this as a church. But the point is this morning, we kind of all believe this, but what do we do with this as a church? What do we do with this passage that says there's personal spiritual forces of evil that are out to get us, and how do we sort of learn how does this interact with our daily lives? Tomorrow you got to get up, some of you got to go to teach, some of you got to go to school to learn, some of you got to go put numbers in their proper order so things work out. Some of you got to go back to the rest home or their house and just figure out how to live with a physical limitation. What do we do with this on a daily basis? And what do we do with this as a church to actually implement this and figure out how to live this? Because as C.S. Lewis says, we're not called to focus on the enemy, we're called to focus on God. So what do we do? Well, when we look at this passage, what we often do is we look at this analogy, first of all. We look at the analogy of Roman armor, because this is the part of the passage that really pops. Jesus, when he taught, used a lot of countryside, rural analogies, didn't he? He said, look at the birds of the air, look at the lilies of the field. And he said, I'm the vine, you are the branches, remain in me and you will bear much fruit. All these sort of rural, pastoral, if you will, rural analogies, and he used a lot of analogies from agriculture because he ministered primarily in his ministry up in Galilee, which was all rural, small towns, villages. They all went out every day into the fields and sort of dealt with plants and animals and agriculture. Paul was someone who was in the cities. He ministered in Roman cities, and every day these people would see Roman soldiers marching around and doing things like that. So a lot of his analogies are more urban, about running the race before you. And this is another one here from the analogy of the Roman army. In case you're wondering, Paul's the guy who wrote Ephesians. That's the connection. All right, so this is a great analogy, right? God's the truth, flesh fitted righteousness, feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And it hit me just this morning as I was going through this, the power of this, because Paul had been preaching to Roman soldiers, at least in part. So these guys, every morning, whenever they actually got dressed for this way, they would put on this stuff. And all this is weapons of warfare. And I always thought, feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And they would have put on their boots, but sometimes even war boots, with spiky things on them maybe. And they knew that they were marching to a war for not peace. And Paul tells them, put on boots, feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. And he totally subverts them. They would have put this stuff on and thought about what they're actually called to do. And it just really struck me that this would have been powerful, especially powerful for a Roman soldier. But it's a Roman analogy for that time. We focus on this. It's really helpful. And I don't want you to forget this as we go on. But what I noticed I've done as I looked at this passage, I've ignored the bookends. I didn't ignore them, but I didn't focus on them. The bookends of that analogy, that Roman armor analogy, is, this is the first one. The verse opens with this. It says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Strong in the Lord and His mighty power. So, when you're thinking about the enemy, obviously don't focus on the enemy, but be strong in the Lord and His mighty power. Well, how do you get into this passage and figure out what it means to resist the enemy and be strong in the Lord? And to do this, really, I want to talk about a missionary story, because that's where this whole thing started with many of us anyway. But the missionary story. And I'll go back to Otto Koning, because I really enjoyed listening to his stuff lately. So Otto Koning, at one point, was a missionary in Papua New Guinea, over north of Australia, Indonesia, and all that kind of stuff. He was over there in the jungles, swamplands of Papua New Guinea in the 50s, post-World War II. And he was there, and what he would have to do is he'd have to kind of walk through jungle paths. And they weren't really paths, they were more log paths, and he'd have to walk on these logs, and there was water and rock all down there. And his job was to, spread the gospel, share the good news of Jesus Christ with the people there. And so he would do that in his own village, but he'd also have to go to other villages. And there was one village where they had a bit of a trouble connecting with, because the chief couldn't leave. He said, whenever I leave, what happens is a snake comes across the path. And so I have this snake my sister gave me. I think that was cute, kids. I can never figure out why she gave me kids snakes. All I thought it was the enemy one. But anyway, she found some snakes and gave them to us. And there you have it. Anyway, the chief, whenever he tried to go see this missionary, would come across a snake on the path. And he'd think, well, there's a snake on the path. You live in the jungle, deal with the snake, get rid of it. But what they had learned is that they dealt with a particular kind of snake. They throw it off the path, they keep going, and it was like a demon snake is what they called it. Something like that. And so they take it off, and they go on. What would happen is this screaming would come out of the jungle, and this you ever heard a banshee, like the banshee scream? Like, it was that kind of thing, like this, rah, this horrible, terrifying scream. And it was debilitating, and it would eventually kill a person who heard it just because they couldn't take it in their mind, or they go off in the jungle and die, I don't know. But it would kill a person. Everybody knew that when this snake was across the path, if you cross it, you're going to die. That's how it went. A lot of things would kill you. They said, you're going to die. So the chief could never get to them. And also it was enemy territory, so I don't think Otto Koning could go to them. But one day, they're like, we got to go there. We got to do something. And so eventually, Otto and his people of the tribe he was with said, we're going to go over there and we're going to witness to them. And he was really slow. They called him Tuon. I think that means white man. They called him Tuon. He was really slow because he wasn't used to walking on these paths, and he had shoes on. The natives, of course, all had no shoes on, and they could grip with their toes. And so he's walking along, and he doesn't see much. He can't see much. He's kind of living under oppression all the time because of the spiritual atmosphere. And he's walking along, and he steps over the snake, and they said, Tuon, you're so dumb. You just stepped over the snake. He says, I don't see no snake. He's like, it's right there. You just stepped over it. Now you're going to die. You're going to die, Tuon. And he says, this is ridiculous. So he grabbed a stick. Maybe he had a walking stick. And he doesn't like snakes anyway. So he said he couldn't see the head or the tail. So he beats the middle real good. And he kills it. And he says, no, I killed it. Let's go. He says, no, you're really dead. A dead snake is worse than a live snake. Man, you're dead. You're going to die. And he says, oh, I'm not dead. Yeah, so he takes it and he throws it off. He says, now, can we go, guys? Can we go? We're supposed to share the good news of Jesus Christ with these people. Let's go. And they talk about it for a while. And I think most of them went back, but one of them decided that he would be willing to go with him. And so they walk a little bit further, and the guy with him has to take a bathroom break. So he goes off and says, you're so slow, I'll catch up with you in a minute anyway. So Otto keeps walking, and sure enough, in a little while, out of this jungle, this dense jungle that's right next to him, he hears this scream, this horrible, horrible scream. And it is debilitating. He falls off this log that he's standing on, and he's sitting there in the muck. He's thinking, what am I supposed to do? And at that point, he remembers the seminar he went to about resisting the enemy, about standing firm in the Lord. He says, well, what should I do? What should I do? And he says, this verse came to mind. He says, greater is he that is within me than he that is in the world. And he quoted this verse. He says, I resist you, Satan, in the name of Jesus, I resist you. And he says, he shouted it real loud, just in case, that was more effective. He just shouted, God, help him, and resist you. And sure enough, that thing went silent. Just like that. He got back up on his log, a little shaken, and the guy came up behind him, and they talked. He says, I heard this thing. Did you hear it? He said, no, I didn't hear it. I heard it. And now we really got to go back, because it'll come back. It'll keep happening. You're just going to die. He says, I'm not going back. I'm not going to do that. And they kept going to this village, and eventually they got there, and they come back, and they shared the gospel with these people. And up to this time, he had 2 converts. He had been there 6 or 7 years. And because he resisted the enemy, in this location here, he said the devil fled from him and didn't come back yet. And so he had freedom to share the gospel, and they could actually hear. And 40 or 50 people gave their lives to Jesus Christ that day. There in the jungle. To the glory of God. Well, he learned this and had to implement this over time, and eventually he realized that resisting the enemy, saying, enemy, this is our place, we are greater than you, greater is he that was in us, greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. They learned that they had to do this if they wanted to show the gospel, because Satan had blinded the eyes, the minds of the unbelievers. So that became a powerfully effective tool. So what do we do with this in our context? Well, I got a story that highlights, I think, what we're called to do. Or at least the reality of it here. That's a lot more personal. So some of you know that about maybe 3 months ago, I got a car stolen. It's a little gray Saturn, it's out of our house, and it was stolen. And that was a difficult thing to process, but eventually it came back. He got arrested one night, and they pulled him out of the car, sent him to jail, and we had the car back. Somebody asked me, well, what's it feel like to get that car back? I said, well, honestly, it's kind of ick. Kind of gross. Kind of yuck. So when I sat in that car, it was probably broke. Partly smelled like cigarette smoke, but it partly was just like spiritually yuck. And I had this, I guess it's the gift of discernment. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it God uses it. And the whole thing was just spiritually yuck. And I drove it home and thought, well, fix this up. I tried to ignore it. But about a month later, I realized that I had been having some really bad days. It's really recent, by the way. I just realized this a couple weeks ago. And the particular emphasis of the bad days was mostly I just wanted to give up. I went to classes meeting. Classes meetings can be not that fun. Classes when churches gather together. I think maybe you were there, right? It wasn't the best classes meeting, but I reacted in such a way that it just drained me physically, spiritually. And the next day, I didn't do much of anything. I just wanted to give up and check out. Thankfully, God told some of you what was going on in prayer. He was praying for me and realizing that something was wrong. And he came up to me in church and asked me what's wrong. I said, well, pretty much, I just want to check out. Any of you ever want to check out? Things get bad. That's the temptation, to check out. I didn't check out and do anything immoral, but I did really want to check out. And that came back a few times that month, more often than I like to admit, to be honest. And finally, about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, I realized what was happening. Every time I drove that stupid car, I would feel like that. Like, every time I sat in there, that stuff would get in me, and I was just like, oh, I'd give up. A couple days later, people pray for me, I'd pray, I'd feel a little bit better again. So I finally realized, I put the 2 pieces, and then examples of this kept coming up, like, wow, that was every single time. But then at least I knew, so I could begin to resist. I parked the car in the driveway and put a radio in it, with a Christian radio in it. And I kind of thought, look, if there's anything evil in there, if there's any demonic element there, they can listen to Christian radio for a while and see the... I don't know. I didn't get taught this stuff, so just going on guesses and intuition here. And I certainly haven't driven the car, and I don't know what I'll do with it. I'll probably invite people to pray and see how God leads. But at least I knew what to resist. And I need to resist the enemy and stand firm in the Lord and not keep getting played by driving this car. And it really hit me after that whole experience was done, is that in those times after I had driven that thing, I just really didn't have much capacity in me to hope, to be confident, to engage. Usually I have a fair bit of energy to go, yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to help, I'm going to ask, whatever. I just had really nothing. Like it was all just rained right off the bottom. And then I thought about some of the people that I try to mentor, or we try to mentor, or we try to help, or even some of us who are just going through a really difficult time. And what I try to do time and time again is I try to give them good information, I try to encourage them, I try to speak faith in their lives. And sometimes just none of it sticks. Have family like that? Close family, distant family, neighbors? We try to share the gospel and just nothing works, and we're still depressed, still going through difficult times. Like, man, if I just tell them something more, if I just give them an article, like, why is this so hard? Why don't they just get it? And I'll say, well, I didn't. I was powerless. I'm a pastor of a church. And then I thought of this verse. Jesus tells a story. It's an analogy, a parable. It says, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. You're realizing what? In some sense, our tendency as a church, as Christians, is what we try to do is we try to plunder a strong man's house before we actually tie him up. And if we want to witness, if we want to be effective, if we want to help people come to Jesus Christ, if we want to help our family, ourselves, our neighbors, experience the good news of Jesus Christ, you might need to tie up the strong view first before you try to convince somebody to follow Jesus Christ. Well, how do we do this? How do we tie up that strong man? Well, the verse is great, right? Weapons of warfare, stand strong in the Lord. But then I have noticed this before. I don't know if I've preached on it, but I have noticed this before. The other bookend to the weapons of warfare passage is this: and pray in the Spirit. All occasions, all kinds of prayers and requests. This keep in mind, keep on praying for all the saints. There's no analogy for the thing of prayer because it covers everything. I think what God invites us into is to stand firm in the Lord, to take the weapons of warfare, the faith, the truth, the salvation, and put it on. But then to pray in the Spirit with all kinds of occasions, all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, keep on praying for everybody. And so what I've done is I want to sort of bring that home in some ways, some practical ways, right? If I just send you home with a couple stories about missionaries and something weird that happened to the pastor, it's not going to really equip you that much. So one thing that I did this week is made this up. Ways to pray for ministry. It should be in your bulletin. I think more and more as a church, if we want God to move in our midst for ourselves and other people, actually I'm going to start Sunday with it. We need to be people who pray for ministry. So I invite you to come early and pray for ministry. Pray for ministry. Come on, don't pray for all those. Pray for the ones that jump out at you. And then this week I made this slide up, which is praying for ministry. There's some things on here. And again, don't try to pray for everything, but pray for things that jump out at you. And what I wanted to do, but didn't have time this week to do, is to make up one that is ways to pray for your own lives. Because the goal of church is not just to come to church. The goal of church is to be equipped to go home and to pray for things in your own life. So maybe you're called to go home and make out a sheet and draw some pictures on it, or get some clip art off the internet, and say, what are the things in my life that are significant, that I need to pray into, that I need to stand firm in the Lord, that I need to be strong in His mighty power, that I need to take the shield of faith up. Maybe you're called to go home and make up one of those sheets for yourself and pray through it and realize that, okay, this is what I need to do. This is the answer. I'm hoping to make one that I can send home with you the next weeks also. So a couple weeks ago, Ron Bruder shared a great story which sort of ties all this together and again brings it to a daily experience level. I'd like to invite Ron to come up and just have a quick conversation at this point. This one again. Let's go up here so we'll get light a little bit. So you were sharing a couple weeks ago that you had kind of a difficult week that week. Maybe you can share that and then maybe a little bit what happened a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think that you had that, it was a few Sundays ago, you had a sermon on prayer.
Mm-hmm.
So I went home, I think it was the week before, it's hard to remember time frames, but I had really bad tooth pain. What happened is, I don't know if anybody else grinds their teeth, but I grind my teeth a lot when I'm worried and anxious, and I have a lot of stress. So I apparently ground my teeth so bad that I cracked the back tooth and I got an infection in my mouth. And then I was in a lot of pain, just a lot of pain. I was miserable. I think I even missed Sunday morning because I was just breathing in pain until the antibiotic that I was taking finally kicked in. And then after the sermon on prayer, I remember talking to my wife, and that's why I'm up here, by the way. So my wife does that stuff to me. She tells me to tell the pastor stuff, and then he makes me come up front. So that's why I'm here. But anyway, so I was really struggling, and I remember I was struggling with other things too, but the pain was so intense in my life at that point that I was like, I just wanted to pray for something. And I remember specifically, very selfish prayer at the time was, God, can you just give me a win? I think it was, I just want to win. And so then I got to the dentist. Thank God I got to the dentist, but then I got that antibiotic in me, and I said, it was clearly an answer to prayer. And then I said it to my wife, and she said, you should tell the pastor how awesome it is. So
And God does a lot of stuff that way too, like Spartans 1. So God didn't answer things. I know these details though, because if you pray, where does this prayer come from? Like, we even get to ask God these things.
Well, I think that's where the win thing came
Yeah.
from, because you want to win in sports, but realistically you want to win in your life.
Yeah.
And so I thought, that's just a really interesting and short prayer. And I think the biggest problem we have a lot of times, at least I do, is always looking for God's answer to our prayers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a big thing for me to see that answer.
Awesome.
That's kind of nice.
I also like it because when I talk about prayer, sometimes people intuitively they think that means I need to go sit down with the book and pray for like 45 minutes and do my duty, and I don't really ever really want to be alone with myself. Or it's like, well, 4 words. I like it. And on the heart is God. A verse I ran into this morning was, we don't know what to do with our eyes on you. So then we talked a little bit about living and serving on fire and following. I like what you said about how, you said how prayer helps.
Well, I think that you were talking about the stages that we're in, and I think that I like to believe that I'm often in the living and serving stage, and would like to believe that I'm in the on fire following stage, but then just the stuff that you just put out this week made me think that, man, maybe I'm down and growing and learning, maybe I'm further down than I thought. And then one of the things that I always remember that brings me either from one stage to the other is just to focus on prayer, focus on communicating more. I mean, realistically, communication is key in marriages and in relationships and everything else, but it's a huge key in our relationship with God. And prayer is the biggest way to go there. And so when you forget to pray, forget to ask for things, you forget to give things to God, and you try to handle worry and stress on your own, you grind your teeth, and the enemy comes in and attacks your mouth, and at least that's what I believe.
That's right on. And I was thinking about these stages a lot this week too, because I talked about them and sent a really long email. Sorry about that. Anyway, I realized that this is kind of inspired to go through all these things I've been going and learning big time too. And I just love what you said about how that relationship carries forward. And you don't have to be fancy, just cry out, right?
Excellent.
Cry out. Awesome, thanks. So here's the question this morning. As we're talking about this, the verse bears meditating on. Be strong in the Lord and His mighty power. Pray in the Spirit on all kinds of occasions, all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, always keep on praying for all the saints, pray for each other. But what I want to do is bring this personal and family. And simply give you time to ask really two questions. One is, where am I getting played? What area of life is really difficult right now? I really don't know how to deal with it. Get pressed on. And I imagine that just because of the human condition, most of us have one or two areas, even if we're experiencing great success. It might be for a family member, it might be for someone at work, but most of us have a couple areas where really our enemies get to us, and we don't know what to do. And maybe we try and do it in our own strength, but the invitation of God is to first identify it, and then to ask God to be strong, give you His mighty strength. And ask Him to intervene and do things that only He can do. And so, if you can, maybe we're going to give some spaces. I have no idea what time it is, but we're going to give just some space for this, and then I'll wrap up. It'll be 4 or 5 minutes. So take some time, draw a picture. If you want, you can come up front and pray. It's still available. You can kneel down where you're at, but ask those two questions. Where is God? Where is the enemy pressing on me? Or in my life with people around me, and how can I stand strong on the Lord? Father God, we pray to you That you taught us that our strength and weakness comes from going to you and saying, we don't have what it takes. We don't have the strength we need. I'm not even sure we want to have the strength we need, Father. But I pray that you set us free. We're here this morning, not even sure, like you set us free. You remove from us any influence of the enemy. Set us free so we can hear your word and have confidence in you and experience the goodness of God in the land of the living. Lord, we want to experience the goodness of so often we haven't. I pray that you would give us that experience, Lord. I pray that you teach us, each individual, what it means to be strong in the Lord and His mighty power in our particular context. Whether it's designing, or leading, or teaching, or learning, or relating, Lord. I pray that you give us what we need to know what it means to be strong in our strength, and the strength of you, and not our strength. Lord, I pray that you use us as a church and fill us up with your Spirit so we can be strong, Lord, in mighty power. I pray that you give us power against the enemy in your strength that we can defeat. And we don't want to get focused on the enemy at all, but we don't want to ignore the enemy either in terms of not even knowing we have one. So I pray that you give us your strength to be strong and be courageous. And for each person who just came to church here for the first time and may not be back, but I pray that you go with them with your strength and lead them and guide them to wherever you're calling them and give them exactly what they need by your power. And for us as a community, we pray that you teach us what it means to be disciples of you. So we can live obedient and experience your goodness, your power in our midst. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. It's the Lord, His mighty hammer, right? And God used to give me dreams, and still does once in a while, of flying. So these memories, dream-wise, of flying. And we should represent the spiritual power, which has in a really good place. And God has called us to be strong in the Lord and His mighty power to do things that are impossible and our own strength to do. We simply don't have the strength. That's the whole point. Christianity isn't about just trying hard. It's about doing things that are impossible to do. Where's that phone book? You want to have the phone book yet? Alright. Throw it over to me. I took it in the first stick home. So obviously it's just a physical material phone book. But to illustrate the point that God has truly called us to do things that are impossible, and sometimes we have to figure out how to do them physically. Cover up.
Come on, Superman.
It's just a phone book, but God has called us to do the impossible in our lives. I want to tell you that. Let's stand as we sing this song, talk about God.